Hello and welcome to the fifth day of the summer school. My name is Utku Savari and I'm a research assistant in school, criminal and criminal procedure law. And I'm going to be the presenter of the session. Today there are going to be two lectures and both of them will be presented by the dear lecturer, Dr. Ronagh McQuigg. Before the start, let me give some brief information about her. Dr. Ronagh is working in Queen's University Belfast School of Law, and her work focuses on international human rights law, especially in domestic abuse as a human rights issue and gender-based violence subjects. She has 3 books that are, and 2 of them about domestic violence as a human rights issue. I want to give you the name of these 2 publications. One of them is the Istanbul Convention, Domestic Violence and Human Rights. The second one is the International Human Rights Law and Domestic Violence. Now we are going to start with the first presentation, and it's going to be the report of Northern Ireland. But before I give the word to Dr. Ronagh, I just want to remind that we have 30 minutes for the first presentation, and after that there will be an question and answer part. Questions will be taken in with written, so everybody can write their questions to the question box. So, Dr. Ronagh, floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed for your very kind introduction. And also thank you very much to all the organisers of this summer school for inviting me to speak to you today. I'm very pleased to be participating in this summer school. So, my country report then is in relation to my own jurisdiction, which is Northern Ireland. Now, just to begin with a little bit of explanation, Northern Ireland is a jurisdiction within the United Kingdom. And the United Kingdom, or UK, is made up of 3 legal jurisdictions. So firstly, England and Wales, secondly, Scotland, and thirdly, Northern Ireland. And each of these 3 jurisdictions takes a slightly different approach to violence against women and domestic violence. And so this presentation is going to focus on the response of my jurisdiction of Northern Ireland. The UK has signed the Istanbul Convention, but it has not actually ratified it as yet. And so that is therefore the position of Northern Ireland as a jurisdiction within the UK. So we're basically in the position of a jurisdiction which has signed the Istanbul Convention, but not actually ratified it as yet. So in Northern Ireland, we don't actually have a legislative definition of domestic violence or violence against women as such. However, we do have a criminal law offence of domestic abuse, which I will discuss a little bit later on. And it is worth noting at this stage that in Northern Ireland, the approach taken by the government to addressing domestic violence is gender neutral. So in March of this year, so this is a very recent development here, a specific offence of domestic abuse passed into law here in Northern Ireland. And the legislation in question is called the Domestic Abuse and Civil Proceedings Act, Northern Ireland 2021. Now, Section 1 of this Act says that a person A commits an offence if they engage in a course of behaviour that is abusive of another person, and the 2 people are personally connected to each other at the time. Okay, so if one person commits a course of behaviour that's abusive of somebody else, and where the two parties are personally connected at the time. Also, there are a couple of further conditions that have to be met in order for the offence to be committed. And these are, firstly, that a reasonable person would consider the course of behaviour to be likely to cause physical or psychological harm. Okay, so there has to be the idea that a reasonable person would consider the course of behaviour to be likely to cause physical or psychological harm, and also that there is an intention to cause physical or psychological harm, or recklessness as to whether such harm is caused. Now, I said that the offence can only be committed if the parties are personally connected with each other, and they are personally connected if they are or have been married to each other, or civil partners of each other, or they are living together or have lived together as if spouses of each other, or they are or have been otherwise in an intimate personal relationship with each other, or members of the same family. Okay, and under Section 8 of the legislation, the offence is aggravated, so it's deemed to be made worse if the victim was under the age of 18 at the time when the offence was committed, or if a relevant child is involved, for example, if a child witnessed the abuse taking place. So those are aggravating factors if the victim was under 18, or if, for example, a child witnessed the abuse happening. And under Section 14 of the Act, someone who commits the offence can be liable to imprisonment for a term not exceeding 14 years or a fine. Also, under the legislation, other offences against a person can be aggravated by reason of involving domestic abuse. So if there's another offence against a person being committed, if there is domestic abuse involved, that is seen to be an aggravating factor. Now, that new act is really important here because prior to the enactment of that legislation, there was no specific offence of domestic abuse here in Northern Ireland. Instead, incidents of domestic abuse had to be prosecuted under general criminal law statutes, such as the Offences Against the Person Act. Now, that was relatively unproblematic as regards incidents of physical violence, because those could be prosecuted under the Offences Against the Person Act as, for example, common assaults, aggravated assaults, assault occasioning actual bodily harm, assault occasioning grievous bodily harm, or so on. But it is now, of course, recognised that physical violence is just one aspect of domestic abuse, and that other forms of abuse, such as coercive control, can be just as damaging. And so in light of that, coercive control was criminalised in other parts of the United Kingdom. So, for example, in England and Wales, it was criminalised back in 2015. And coercive control was criminalised in Scotland in 2018. So that meant that up until March of this year, Northern Ireland was the only jurisdiction within the United Kingdom in which coercive control was not criminalised. And so the rectification of that clear deficiency in the legislative response to domestic abuse here in Northern Ireland is certainly very much to be welcomed. Steps were also taken in the new legislation to assist complainants in giving evidence in court in cases involving the domestic abuse offence. So such complainants are now eligible for special measures when giving evidence. And so those can include things like screening the complainant from the accused, giving evidence by way of a live link, giving evidence in private, video recording evidence, and so on. And also, nobody who is charged with an offence involving domestic abuse can now cross-examine the complainant in person. So that's our criminal law response to domestic abuse. As regards violence against women more broadly, this would fall under the more general legislation on violent offences, like the Offences Against the Person Act that I've just mentioned. So violence against women would fall under crimes such as assault, assault occasioning actual bodily harm, assault occasioning grievous bodily harm, and so on. So the victim's complaint then usually begins the process of the investigation and prosecution of acts of domestic violence and violence against women. So the investigation usually begins with the victim's complaint. If the victim then does not wish to proceed with the complaint, it is still possible for the case to continue, but it may be more difficult to achieve a successful prosecution. And in a criminal case here, the complainant's role is that of a witness, because all criminal prosecutions here are taken by the state. So if it's a criminal prosecution, the complainant's role is that of a witness. It's the state that actually brings the prosecution. And essentially the procedure in a criminal case is that the police collect the evidence, and then it's up to the prosecution service as to whether there is sufficient evidence for the case to proceed in terms of whether there is a reasonable chance of the prosecution being successful. So I've discussed the criminal law measures regarding domestic violence and violence against women. As regards the private law measures, we call these civil law measures in this jurisdiction. And the main piece of legislation concerning the civil law measures relating to domestic violence is called the Family Homes and Domestic Violence Northern Ireland Order 1998. And there are two basic types of remedy under the civil law. There is firstly the non-molestation order, and secondly the occupation order. Now, a non-molestation order is simply an order that the respondent doesn't molest or intimidate or harass another person who is associated with him or her, or does not molest a relevant child. And non-molestation orders are quite widely available here. The occupation order, on the other hand, is the order that can actually remove an abuser from the home or parts of the home, or even from the area in which the home is situated. However, occupation orders are viewed by the courts here as quite draconian measures, because they actually remove someone from their home. And so that means that they are less widely available than non-molestation orders. So it's the victim who applies for either a non-molestation order or an occupation order, or both. And if they are breached, the victim can make a civil law complaint. Breach of the orders is also, excuse me, also normally a criminal offence. Okay, so if one of these orders is breached, it is normally a criminal offence. And so the perpetrator can usually be arrested by the police for breaching one of these orders. As regards statistics, according to statistics released by our police service here, there were 31,848 domestic abuse incidents in Northern Ireland during 2020, and that is one of the highest rates here since such records began back in 2004-2005. In June of 2019, Criminal Justice Inspection Northern Ireland, so the Criminal Justice Inspection system, published a report on the handling of domestic violence and abuse cases by the criminal justice system here. And basically, there were 7 recommendations made as regards improvements which were deemed to be necessary. So these recommendations included things like the police developing an action plan to develop further their approach to dealing with cases of domestic abuse, and to address issues which were highlighted as regards the training and development of new recruits and first responders in relation to coercive and controlling behaviour, harassment and stalking behaviour, and risk assessment practices in cases of domestic abuse. There was also a recommendation that the police should develop an action plan to further develop multi-agency safeguarding arrangements for cases of domestic abuse. And it was recommended that the police and the prosecution service should develop an implementation plan to further develop the prosecution team approach for cases involving domestic abuse. There was also a recommendation about ensuring the delivery and rollout of Northern Ireland-wide schemes to enabling the clustering of domestic abuse cases to a designated court in each district, and about developing a properly costed contract for an independent domestic violence advisory service to address the risk to the safety of victims. And also the Department of Justice should review potential inadequacies in the current legislation regarding the act of choking or strangulation, and develop plans for legislation to introduce protection orders for stalking and harassment. So basically in 2019, there were a number of recommendations made in terms of improvements that should be made to the criminal justice system here. In criminal proceedings, it is the victim who is at the centre of the risk analysis in cases of domestic violence. So it is the victim who is at the centre of the risk analysis. Support measures for victims of domestic violence are contributed to by non-governmental organisations, and one of the main organisations here is called Women's Aid Northern Ireland. They provide refuge accommodation to women and their children who are suffering abuse within the home, and they also provide a range of support services to enable women who are leaving a violent situation to rebuild their lives and the lives of their children. For example, emotional and practical support is offered with in relation to legal, welfare, housing and money matters. And Women's Aid also provide a range of support services to children and young people who have experienced domestic violence, and they run preventative education in schools and other settings. Domestic violence has certainly increased in Northern Ireland during the COVID pandemic. As I said earlier, according to statistics released by the police, there were 31,848 domestic abuse incidents in Northern Ireland during 2020, and that is one of the highest rates since such records began. Since the first lockdown here began on the 23rd of March of 2020, the police had by May of 2020, so within 2 months, received at least 3,755 calls relating to domestic abuse. And then in the 3 weeks from the 1st of April until the 21st of April 2020, the police received 1,919 calls regarding domestic abuse, which was an increase of 10% on the figure which were usually received prior to COVID. By the end of April 2020, 3 people had been killed as a result of domestic violence since the beginning of the lockdown, so that's within 1 month. And so those are quite high statistics for Northern Ireland, which is quite a small jurisdiction. And on the 23rd of March of 2021, which was a year since the beginning of the first lockdown here, Women's Aid Northern Ireland joined with a number of other bodies working in the area of combating domestic violence to issue a statement asserting that, and I quote, "It was clear from the outset that lockdown measures would exacerbate women and girls' experiences of violence and abuse and shut down routes to safety and support. Over the past year, this has been borne out in the huge increases in demand our sector has witnessed, the increasing complexity of need from those we support, the strains that frontline workers have faced in responding to survivors and trauma, the new ways that perpetrators are using COVID-19 as tools for abuse and control, and of course the tragic murders of women and children." Measures have been taken by the government in Northern Ireland to address the issue of domestic abuse since the onset of COVID-19. And since the beginning of the pandemic, steps have been taken by both the Northern Ireland Department of Justice and the police to raise awareness among victims of domestic abuse that help and support are still available. For example, the Department of Justice implemented a media campaign entitled "See the Signs," and the police initiated another media campaign termed "Behind Closed Doors." Also, although the work of the courts had been severely affected by the pandemic, emergency applications for non-molestation orders could still be made through the family proceedings courts, and the Departments of Justice and Health issued guidance stating that household isolation instructions, which were introduced as a result of the COVID pandemic, did not apply if a person needed to leave their home to escape from domestic abuse. And the guidance also provided advice on what domestic abuse is, what signs to look for, and where help could be obtained. In addition, the police led a multi-agency proactive operational response in collaboration with the Departments of Justice, Health and Communities, as well as voluntary sector partners, with the aim of ensuring a joined up approach to the prevention of harm and the provision of support. And the police, in collaboration with Women's Aid and in conjunction with our housing executive here, established crash pads, as they were called, in various towns, and those were to enable a safe environment of self-isolation for victims of domestic abuse suffering with COVID. Nevertheless, while there were certainly a number of very meritorious responses to the issue of domestic abuse in Northern Ireland during the period spanned by COVID-19, problems do persist. And in a joint statement of March 2021 from a number of bodies working in the area of combating domestic abuse, including Women's Aid, it was asserted that there was still serious concern regarding the lack of meaningful partnership working between the government and the specialist sector. And it was said that this limited the ability to meet the needs of women and girls and the life-saving specialist services that support them. And essentially urgent action was needed on funding, equal protection and support, prevention and practical measures to protect women and girls experiencing violence and abuse during COVID-19. And it was asserted in that report that, and I quote, whilst the UK government has delivered emergency funding for the violence against women and girls sector over the past year, it has been piecemeal, fragmented and unequal. In particular, specialist services in Northern Ireland did not receive comparable levels of funding to other parts of the UK. And the statement concluded that violence against women is still not factored in at the highest levels of the pandemic response, not seen as a fundamental priority in the public health response. As the first year of COVID-19 comes to an end, we cannot return to business as usual. We need a new approach which equally protects all women and girls and ends the societal inequalities that drive violence and abuse against them. It is of particular note that Northern Ireland is currently the only jurisdiction within the UK which does not have a strategy specifically dedicated to addressing gender-based violence. And in March of this year, Women's Aid Northern Ireland launched a petition calling on the Northern Ireland government to develop and implement a strategy on violence against women and girls. And in addition, in April of this year, a follow-up review was published in respect of the 2019 report by Criminal Justice Inspection Northern Ireland on the handling of domestic abuse cases by the criminal justice system here. So that's the report that I referred to earlier. And although 7 recommendations had been made in the 2019 report, the follow-up review found that only 1 of those had been implemented, whilst 4 had been partially achieved and 1 not implemented. So the new domestic abuse legislation was welcomed, and also evidence that the police and the prosecution service had improved how they shared information and worked together in relation to cases of domestic abuse. However, the report also said that there was disappointment with the pace of progress, and that key recommendations to implement an advocacy service to support victims of domestic violence and abuse, and to establish regional domestic violence and abuse courts remained outstanding. And in addition, it was remarked, and I quote, "Domestic violence and abuse is a long-standing problem throughout our community that has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, with many new and repeat victims finding their homes are not a safe place, but a place of fear and anxiety during the lockdown restrictions." So in conclusion then, the pandemic has exposed and exacerbated pre-existing problems with the responses of to domestic violence by Northern Ireland. Essentially, as was asserted in the joint statement issued by Women's Aid Northern Ireland, along with a range of other bodies in March 2021, we cannot return to business as usual. We need a new approach which equally protects all women and girls and ends the societal inequalities that drive violence and abuse against them. There are certainly lessons to be learnt from the COVID-19 pandemic. And the fact that the pandemic has served to highlight the shortcomings of responses to this issue may contribute towards an amelioration in such responses in the future. And so the challenge must now be to act on the lessons of the pandemic and work towards improving responses to domestic abuse and indeed violence against women more generally. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ronagh, for the interesting presentation. So now it's time to question and answer part, but for the recording purposes, we need to vocalize the questions. So for each question, I'm going to read aloud first. Then we will happy to hear your answer for them. So thank you. Let's wait a little bit for the questions. Everybody can write to the chat box, and also you can read directly from there. I think we need a little time for the questions. Dear Professor, I am human rights professional looking for practical experience in the field of domestic violence. What would you recommend me?
Okay, well, thank you very much for your question. Well, what I would recommend is if there are any particular groups in your jurisdiction, sort of non-governmental organisations which offer help or support to victims of domestic violence, I would recommend that you would get in contact with them and see are there any volunteering opportunities to work with such groups. I know in my own jurisdiction of Northern Ireland, Women's Aid, which is one of the key organisations which provides support to victims of domestic violence, they have a volunteering scheme, so people can volunteer to get involved with their work. For example, they can, Women's Aid will train them, for example, to help with the helpline, for example, and so on and so forth. So if there are any non-governmental organisations like that in your jurisdiction, I would recommend that you contact them because they may well have volunteering opportunities in their areas. So I think that would be a very good way of getting practical experience as regards domestic violence, certainly.
Thank you very much for your answer. So if there is no answers, we can take a break now, and the next presentation will start in 13:45. So see you back in there.